Hello and welcome to the penultimate episode of Life, Passion and Business. Hello, my name is Paul Harvey and I am a midlife coach, and you are listening to a Life, Passion and Business shortcast. Now, over the last few years I have spoken to hundreds of people and I've discovered that our story is everything, because what we do, feel or experience is based on the stories that we tell ourselves. This shortcast is a bite-sized episode to explore the ingredients of a good life. We bring out the thoughts, tips and tools so you can try them on for size. So let's explore and see what is possible. Yes, we are coming to an end. And I've been thinking a lot today about making this recording and talking to you here and trying to kind of work out where I'm going to take this or how I'm going to do this, because it's like there is so much to say, and yet I don't want to make a many hour long podcast. I don't want to be a Joe Rogan on the subject, because at the end of the day, this is the end. I am finishing this show. So I thought I would start this one, as in this is the first part of 2, and it may go to 3, but I think it's the first part of 2. So I think this is definitely the penultimate. I wanted to talk about why I started this podcast, just to remind us what this was about. And it is very much about the words behind me, these words here, the meaning of life. So let's take us back to the beginning. It was February 2017 when my father died. Now, my father was 89 years old and he did not want to be 90. I've said this many times on the show. And so we had planned to go and see him on his 90th birthday. And instead we were actually going to see his house on his 90th birthday, because it was literally days before, it was 2 weeks before his 90th birthday that we went to that he died. And it was very sudden and it was very quick, mercifully. And it brought it all home to me, going into his house, how his life had become small in some way, in many ways. He had made it small. But there was more to it than that. You see, now it wasn't the loss of my father that was bothering me most of all. And it took me months to distill this down, this conversation in my head. It was the fact that he had not actively lived life. And so when my mother died, like 20 years before, he was living his life vicariously through her. And so when she passed, he made the conscious choice. Well, I'm not even sure it was a conscious choice. He made the choice not to participate in life that much. And so while, life blossomed around him, he gave my brother and I money to buy houses, to start us on the housing ladder. And so we started, we were in relationships and we started families, and he became a grandparent. And while he was lovely with my son, he never really engaged with it, he never really embraced being a granddad. From his perspective, it was always about, Mum would have loved this. And his lens in life always was through grief. So grief was a massive part of his last 20 years. But what I realized, as I said, going forward, was that he never really gripped on to what his life was about. He was a child born in a poverty, in a world of poverty, and he spent a lot of his life in that environment. He did well for himself in terms of the role that he chose in life, and he raised a family, and he bought a house and was relatively successful. He's probably the last generation that will have that ability to be able to be a single breadwinner in a house and bring up 2 children and buy a house at the same time. We know the situation, in the financial situation of this world at this time, and he was probably one of the last of that generation that could do that. But I digress into my politics. So let's carry on talking about where I was at this time. So I was in marketing. I was becoming more disillusioned with the industry. Harbingers of kind of the future, I'm guessing. And I'd already made some decisions a few years before to kind of change who I did marketing for, how I did marketing. I was already conscious that it was consuming the planet, and I really wanted to do something else. But the big thing for me was realizing that I was quite fed up. I I didn't have much of a direction, and this idea of meaning of life for me was still an open question. It was very much an open question. And I realized that my father had struggled with that. I don't think he'd actually embraced it in kind of from those perspective, but for him, nothing had any meaning. And that was the problem. That was where his issue lay. He didn't know how to engage with life, and he almost chose not to. So recognizing that I am very similar to my father and I have a lot of traits of his, I recognized that I needed to do something about it, because I could see myself becoming equally cynical, just as unhappy as he was. And I realized that at the time, I was like 53 at the time. And I realized that, hey, I got to do something about this. I was 55 at the time, should I say. I got to do something about this, because if I don't do something about this, if I don't somehow grip onto this, find a solution to what life means for me, then I'm destined to become as miserable as my father. So that was the driving thought behind a lot of this stuff. And so the podcast kind of started to coalesce in my head around the May of 2017, around that sort of time. And I was going away to a mastermind at the time, I think, and I had that project in my pocket and another one. And I was still not ready to release that project. I was still not ready to talk about it. So I did something else instead. I talked about another project at the mastermind, which I think in hindsight, probably would have been better the other way around. Because I think I'd have learned a lot more faster had I gone the other direction. But, we do what we do. We make those choices. I had a lot of friends and connections in business. So that's why I called it Life, Passion and Business, because I wanted to integrate it into my business world, into my business, into the whole thing of business, the business of life, the business of business, the business of that thing. And I had so many connections in business that it was easy to pull people in to have conversations. And so that's kind of how it was born. That's kind of how I started it. So my initial sense of it is that we would talk about anything. It was about the journey. And what I wanted to know from people is, how do you do this thing called life? How are you? What's the journey been for you? And how are you experiencing it? And in order to make that work, I came up with some questions. And the basic questions were always, what are you passionate about? And how is passion featured in your life? Because this whole idea of driving to do stuff, this idea of seeking to do things, has to have something that's driving it. And my sense of it was passion, the passion for life, the passion for living. So that's where I was with that bit. And then I realized that this whole idea of success was really interesting, because I was in the business world, and success was always, getting the six-figure business. It was always the passive income. It was always about crushing it until you make it. It was always about these platitudes and things that were required to be a successful person in the business world. And I was interviewing business people anyway. So for me, it was, well, okay, how do we define success? Is success crushing it? Is success absolutely, annihilating the opposition, as in marketing terms? Who knows? And the third question was always this idea about contribution, about what we bring to the world. And that was always fascinating, because obviously it's the contribution side is the legacy aspect of it. It's about what we leave behind in many respects. And so that was very interesting conversation. And over time, the contribution to the self came in terms of how do we look after ourselves in all of this, because that's what really occurred to me from a lot of the conversations I was having. A lot of people in the conversations were saying, yes, I drove really, really hard into this, but I actually did not look after myself on the journey. And so that's why it became an important question for me, was how are you looking after yourself? How are you putting your own oxygen mask on first, to take the airline kind of like, analogy. So that was fascinating to hear those questions. And then of course the final question, which was always interesting, is what are you doing it all for? Which is the meaning question. Oh, I keep doing the wrong side, don't I? It's behind me that side. It's the meaning question. What is it? Why are we doing this? What is it all about? And that's how it was all born. It literally was an exploration of those questions, looking to get answers to those questions. Now, I'm going to leave what I discovered to next week, to the final episode, and I'm going to leave some stuff for you in that final episode so that you can have something to take away from it. As I said, this is the penultimate show. If you have enjoyed any of this stuff, do go back and look at the catalogue. What's going to happen is the show is going to go into archive, so I will archive the whole lot. It will all be available, always be available, for as long as I keep paying. And it's a nice idea that it is always there. Anyway, it has been an amazing journey. I'm so delighted to be here today having this conversation, and I will see you again in a couple of weeks. Anyway, all the best.